Hi everyone, so I have something here that I've been wanting to try out for a while now, the Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers. And the reason I've been wanting to try these out is because they have a brush tip. I love brush tip markers, and of course I'm gonna compare these to the Copic markers. What kind of art channel would I be if I didn't? Will the Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers compete to one of the most popular markers on the market? Let's find out. I have them in 4 different color sets. I have them in hues, however you pronounce that, essentials, tints, and portrait colors. Ooh, look at that pretty rainbow. And it seems like they come in a plastic tray. So I guess that is convenient if you want to have them in some sort of order when having them on your desk while you're drawing. Ooh, amethyst, my favorite gemstone. And one of Spectrum Noir's trademarks, or what you could call it, is that their markers have this hexagon shape, and to be honest, I am not a huge fan of the shape. It feels a little chunky and it gets a little sharp in your hand with all the edges. I can imagine this being very helpful to some people having a chunkier type of marker, but to me, I have very small hands. It just feels weird and uncomfortable. This is what it looks like if you compare it to a Copic marker. Anyway, we have color names and color codes on both the nibs, and the barrel itself is just plain and gray with Illustrator by Spectrum Noir written on it and 2 little images of both the nibs. At one end we have a very nice and pointy brush tip. Hello Sally. Va? Vad gör du? And a Sally cat butt. Yeah, don't mind me. That completely threw me off. Yeah, here we have the Spectrum Noir brush tip compared to the Copic sketch one. And then we have on the other side, and usually on a Copic marker, we have a chisel nib. Personally, I never use the chisel nib on a Copic marker because the brush tip works really well to covering up larger areas, so I never have to use the chisel nib. But on the Spectrum Noir marker, we get a tiny little bullet nib instead. To be honest, I think this is a much better combination than having a brush tip and a chisel nib. Let's say that you have a regular bullet tip markers like the Pro markers, for example. Then you really need a chisel tip to fill up larger areas more quickly and to get an even nice color, because the bullet tip is quite small, so you will need a wider nib. But if you have a brush nib, you can already fill up larger areas pretty quickly and you can get quite even colors. The brush tip is already doing all the job that a chisel nib does. That is why I find it more useful to have a bullet tip that is stiff so you can make smaller details with. Something I just noticed is that they have the color codes written on the caps, but it isn't written anywhere on the actual marker. On the Copic marker, we have the color code on the barrel, and we also have a little line marking the brush tip side, but the only thing we have on the Illustrator marker is this. It is sort of like a thicker line on the bullet tip side, but it isn't very visible. It is the exact same color as the rest of the barrel, so I'm gonna have to turn it this way to see what color I'm using, and I'm gonna turn it this way to see what nib I'm using, because it isn't very obvious which one is which. It will be a lot of turning of markers. Anyway, let's swatch these, and then I'm gonna do a side-to-side comparison with the Copic markers. Let's start with Cocktail Pink. Ooh, that is a soft brush tip. Nice thin bullet tip. They are a little squeaky, the bullet tips. Yeah, here we have them. I really like these two sets together. They look so pretty. I think the portrait set is a little weird. I think it is supposed to be skin tones, but there isn't really any mid-tone. There are two very light ones and two very dark ones, but there's really nothing in between. So let's do some comparison to the Copic markers. As we know, Copics are great and all that, but what I think is stopping a lot of people from buying them is the price. The price may differ a little depending on where you get them. One single little marker is usually around $7 to $8, sometimes $9. That is insane, but I'm gonna be generous and write $7.5 because if you get them in sets they are usually a little cheaper. Then we have the Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers where you can get one marker for $2.50. That is a lot cheaper than the Copic sketch markers. Then we have available colors, which basically means how many colors the markers are available in. Last time I checked, there were 350 available colors for Copics. Also, do you pronounce it Copic or Copic? Let me know in the comments. And for the Illustrator markers, we have 216 colors, which is a little less, but then on the other hand, 216 colors is still a lot. So as we already know, Copic sketch comes with brush tips, and so do also the Spectrum Noir Illustrators. And I know that some people don't really care about brush nibs, but it is really hard to find good brush tip markers. So if we can find a decent brush marker to a decent price, that is awesome. And then we have single, which means can you buy the markers one by one? Take Uhuhu markers for example. They are only available in sets and they are not refillable, which means that if you need to replace one color, you have to replace the whole set. So that is why it is so great to be able to buy your markers one by one, which also means that you can customize your color palette a little more easily. You can buy Copic markers one by one, so you can also do with the Illustrator markers. Then we come to refillable / spare nibs. Even if the refill is a little more expensive, it will still save you money in the long run, and you don't have to buy new markers all the time. Copics are refillable, and you can also buy replacement nibs. Spectrum Noir is also refillable, and they also have replacement nibs available. And then we have colorless blender marker, which both brands have available. I'm gonna do a nib test just to see if there is any differences between the markers. Here I used a lot of pressure and here I used almost no pressure at all, and here's the bullet tip. As you can see, we can get quite a wide variety of lines with one nib only. The only thing that I'm noticing is that the nib is quite flimsy, so when pushing a bit harder, the nib is bending and creating these little points or whatever you could call it. But let's see if the Copics is doing the same thing. As you can see, there are almost no difference at all, but I can clearly tell that the Copic brush nib is a little less flimsy. It got a little more structure to it, it feels like. It is a little easier to control, so when pushing down a bit harder, you're not getting these weird peaks or whatever you could call it. And then the last test, let's see how these are to blend. I'm gonna try to make some sort of gradient and we'll see if there is any difference. So there we have the Spectrum Noir. To be honest, these markers, they feel a little dry. And yeah, it isn't a perfect gradient, but I think it was a little tricky blending the colors because the nib is so flimsy. It is just everywhere. So I'm gonna try and see how it works with the Copic markers. It feels like It was a little easier blending the Copic markers. Seems like the colors on the Copic side is much brighter, and I tried to use as similar colors as possible. Also, these ones, they are brand new. They shouldn't be dry or anything, but still they felt very dry compared to the Copics. I'm just gonna draw a quick line and see what it will look like. That's not a very straight line, but anyway. At the beginning it's darker and then it gets lighter and lighter, but with the Copic one you get a consistent line or color throughout the whole stroke. Yeah, that's another observation. Looking at it, I think the Copics looks a little greater. It is hard to show, but the feeling of the brush nib, it is also very important, and I do think the Copic markers, they feels a little better. It is easier to control the brush nib with the Copic markers than with the Spectrum Noir Illustrator. But then again, we have the price difference. For that price, this may not be that bad. But I think the best way to find out how a marker is and how it performs, let's use it for an actual drawing or illustration. And I'm gonna tell you more about what I think about the Spectrum Noir Illustrators. So I'm picking out some Copic markers, trying to match the Spectrum Noir colors, because I figured the best way to compare the markers is to simply just color the same image. So I made a simple little drawing of a doggo on the iPad and then I printed it twice. So I thought I would do some fancy editing and have the drawings lined up next to each other while I was drawing them, so you could see them both on the same time, synchronized and all that. But I clearly didn't remember in which order I did the coloring steps when I did the Copic drawing, so much for synchronization. Also, another thing I just want to mention really quick, that my art is now available as art prints among other things over at redbubble.com. I will have a link in the description box below and in the iCard section. I try to update my store every week, so there is always something new for you to check out. So when talking about Copics, it really sounds like these glorified drawing tools that are golden and nothing can beat them. And of course they are great if their qualities is what you are looking for in a marker. To me it is the brush nib and that they are refillable that lured me into the Copic club. After been working with bullet-tipped and non-refillable markers for years, I found that the Copics really made the work a lot easier for me, and that is just my personal preferences. Of course, different markers works for different people, but as I mentioned before, Copics are expensive, and finding cheaper options that actually matches their qualities is a challenge, and that is why I got so excited when I did research about the Illustrator markers, because it actually seems like the Copics have met their match. Both are refillable, they have brush nibs, you can get them one by one. There is a little less color options for the Spectrum Noir ones though, but over 200 colors, it is still a lot. And the Spectrum Noir is cheaper, so they should be a perfect alternative. But all of that, it is just technical details. A marker can still be crap to work with. Looking at Copics, I love the brush nib. It has a good structure, it is flexible but without being too soft, so you can easily control the pen strokes. And here is where I started to have my doubts about the Illustrator markers. First using these markers and then the Copics, it was just so clear that the Spectrum Noir brush tips, they are not that awesome in my opinion. And I have to say that they are very durable. They kept their shape really well, no fraying or anything, but they were just too soft. When adding a little more pressure, the whole nib bent and I ended up drawing with the side of it kind of, and I will talk more about that issue later. But just looking at it, comparing the Spectrum Noir drawing to the Copic drawing, there isn't that much different to be honest. Heck, the Spectrum Noir almost looks better with brighter colors, but that might be because I didn't have matching colors, but honestly the Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers, they looks great, but I think I will still need to do a little more testing. You might recognize this dear lady. It is the same one as I colored in the antique watercolor video. It feels a little cheap reusing my art, but I actually wasn't planning another drawing and I was running out of time, so I hope you can forgive me. I just picked something that I had available. So I felt since it was a pretty small drawing, the first one I did, I needed something bigger to really try out the qualities and the durability of the markers and the brush nib. So I'm coloring the skin here with one of the lighter colors from the portrait set, and here is where I started to run into some problem. The nib started to become very dry, and I mentioned it before that they felt a little drier than the Copics, and here it really started to show. I don't know if the marker is running out of ink or if the ink isn't flowing out to the nib fast enough. I mean, I have used this color only when doing the swatching and for this drawing, so it can't possibly be out of ink already. That would be really bad. And I had a theory that the bending of the nib is causing the ink to not flow out properly, but after letting the marker rest for a while, it is still quite dry, so I don't really know what to think. So I'm really glad I did this extra test. Drawing the smaller piece did give me a lot of good information, but now using them on a bigger piece, they are really showing what they've got, obviously. Also something completely different, I just love drawing skin with markers. I find it so satisfying blending the colors and adding blush and shading. And yeah, the markers might be a little dry to work with, but they look so vibrant and so good. I wouldn't be able to tell them apart from Copic art. I really wish that I would love them. They could be such a good complement marker, but the brush nib is just not doing it for me. I can live with that it is a little softer and flimsy, but it is just too bendy and hard to control. And another thing that turned me off, a marker should not run out of ink that fast. It is unacceptable and very disappointing, but I didn't notice anything when I was working on the smaller piece, so maybe they are not suited for larger art pieces, which is kind of ridiculous. And yes, they are uncomfortable to hold and to work with, at least for me with smaller hands. And now we're getting into another problem area, the hair. And I was thinking a gradient from blue to green. It is colors that are fairly easy to blend, but here I met the same problem as before when drawing the skin. The markers started to dry out. They worked pretty well for the first half of the hair, but then on the second half it started to really show. I am baffled. These are brand new markers. How can't they have more ink in them? Yes, it is a larger area, but it isn't that big, and the nib is just so soft. I almost wish I had a chisel nib instead of this wobbly thing. And since I'm trying to get more ink out of it, I'm pushing harder, so it is almost at a 90-degree angle. I don't know if you can see it, it is crazy. So the drier the marker got, the more I pushed and the harder I gripped the marker. And now I'm starting to really feel the sharp edges of the barrel. My hands started to get really sore, and it may sound like I'm complaining and whining, but it was actually quite a struggle to color the hair with a dry marker, floppy nib and uncomfortable marker barrel. However, the nib may seem flimsy, but it is durable as heck. I rubbed it pretty hard on the paper and it bended to almost a 90-degree angle, but it didn't break or fray or anything, so that is quite impressive. But yeah, because of the dry marker, I weren't able to blend the colors of the hair as well as I wanted, so that is unfortunate. So let's draw some sort of conclusion here. The Spectrum Noir have so many qualities that could compete to Copics. The price alone should make them worth it. Even if they are not the cheapest markers out there, they are still pretty cheap. They are definitely not all bad, even if they have things to wish for. The art that I created with them, it looks really great, to be honest. They blend really nicely when they are not too dried, of course. You can see it just on the skin on the lady here. I think it looks so smooth. The colors are nice too, very vibrant. I can't say that it is the first marker I would recommend to anyone, but I also can't say that you should never try these because they have some good qualities too. It is all about preferences as usual. So do they compete to Copics? Well, it is the only marker that I have tried so far that actually meets so many of the Copic qualities, but then you also have all the things that I have mentioned in this video. I think you just have to ask yourself what you are looking for in a marker, do some research, and then decide yourself if you think it is worth it. So I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found this little review a little helpful at least. So let me know if there are any other art supplies or markers that you would like me to try out and review. So yeah, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I hope I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, keep drawing my happy cats, bye!